walking from my home, which was on Norton, down to Lemert Park. As I was walking along, I happened to glance over at my side, and I saw this strange sight. It looked like a mannequin that had been cut in half.
Downtown Hollywood, a city that bustles with activity and is studded with the names of stars. They're not all stars, of course. Today they're starlets, but all of them want to be the big names of tomorrow. It's happened before, and it will happen again in Hollywood, because this is the city of the stars.
That audio clip played at the start of the video was from a lady named Betty Bersinger, a lady who, on the morning of January 15th, 1947, discovered something in a vacant lot just off of a sidewalk in Los Angeles. And in her own words, you heard her say that it looked something like a mannequin, a broken up, pale, white mannequin. She had no idea that she was actually looking at the corpse of a 22-year-old girl named Elizabeth Short. Without even knowing it, Bersinger had just stumbled upon the crime scene of what has now become one of the most mysterious murders of all time. Elizabeth Short was born in 1924 in the city of Boston, Massachusetts. Now, her childhood was very strange to say the least. Her father was a man named Cleo Short, who for a living designed and created mini golf courses, which may I add is probably the coolest job ever. BRB changing my major. But in the 20s, as the Depression hit, I think the demand for mini golf courses probably went down a little bit, if we're being honest. And soon Cleo was facing some real financial pressure. And in 1929, Cleo drove his car to a bridge, parked it there, and jumped off. Except he actually didn't. He faked his own suicide and promptly fled the area and moved all the way to California. That's really messed up. So for most of Elizabeth's childhood, she believed that her father was dead, and everybody else did too. Until one day, Cleo actually sent a letter and apologized to her and basically explained the whole situation. And Elizabeth, or as many people called her, Beth, actually accepted his apology. And they actually developed quite a good relationship just from sending letters back and forth, which that's really mature of her. Like, I can't imagine most people would just be that willing to forgive their father if they did something like that. Because as I've stated before, that's pretty messed up. And now it was actually around the same time where Beth started to develop a love for the cinema. She loved movies, and even more so, she loved the idea of Hollywood. And she soon became engrossed in the idea that someday she would be a star herself. And that's when she made the connection. She wants to move to California to become a movie star, and her dad was living in California at the time. Ding. So she made the decision to pack her bags and move cross country to live with her dad in California. And her time in California really didn't go too well. Like, really didn't go too well. It wasn't even a full year that she had lived there until her father had kicked her out of the house. Cleo claimed that she was lazy and just mooching off him just because she needed a place to live. And finally, he just had enough and said, "Get out." Now, eventually, Beth was able to get a job, but she still wasn't able to afford a place to live, so she was just kind of bouncing from household to household. She really wasn't doing well. And after a brief run-in with a law where she was caught underage drinking, she was actually sent back home to Boston. And if we're being honest, she probably should have learned at this point that maybe LA just wasn't right for her, and maybe she should have stayed in Boston. But she was young and she had these dreams, and honestly, I gotta respect that. So just a short while later, she moved back to California. And this time she moved into the heart of Hollywood. Now, there are plenty of details about this time period in Beth's life, but I'm just going to kind of give you a brief rundown because it's very repetitive. But basically, Beth was living a lifestyle of partying and going out and drinking and basically just having a grand old time. And all the while, she was unable to find a steady job and a steady household. Again, she was just moving from house to house in the area until she would eventually get kicked out for being a bit of a slob. Now, eventually, she met a man that she was actually kind of into, and his name was Robert Manley. But the only thing was that he was married and he had a kid. but the two of them maintained a good friendship and they hung out almost every week. Now, on January 8th, 1947, the two had actually attended a party together, and later that night they stayed in the same hotel room. But supposedly they hadn't slept together that night or at any other points in their friendship. And in that night in particular, Beth had actually slept on a chair in the room, while Manley fell asleep on the bed. I'll be honest, it seems a little bit sketchy, and it definitely kind of is, but anyway, we'll keep that in mind for later. So the next morning, Manley had to leave the hotel, and he said goodbye to her in the lobby, and that was the last time that Beth was ever seen in public alive. So for the next 6 days, Beth was not seen by anybody, and she had actually disappeared. Which, you know, I love my disappearances, so yes, but also no, that's horrible, oh my god. And her body was discovered 6 days later on the 15th. And her body was messed up. She had slits cut into her mouth to form a smile, almost like the Joker. And her body was also cut completely in half, and it was drained of all its blood, which is why the body was so white that it was mistaken for a mannequin. And the body was clearly cleaned at a location separate from where it was dumped, because there wasn't a speck of blood on the ground. Now, along with this, chunks were removed from separate parts of her body, and there were also all sorts of cuts and bruises all over. And her body was posed in a very sexually suggestive way, with the legs spread open and the arms over her head like that. And her eyes were wide open. Now, doctors suggest that whoever had committed this crime must have had some form of medical experience because of how particular and exact these cuts were. And so because of this, many people believe that the killer is either a doctor or a surgeon, because the way this body was dissected, it was professionally done, which sounds very strange, but it's the truth. Now, this gruesome murder immediately became a huge national story, and Beth was quickly dubbed the Black Dahlia, which was a reference to a popular movie at the time called Blue Dahlia. So over the course of the next few months, the LAPD received a bunch of letters from the supposed killer of the Black Dahlia. And adding validity to this anonymous person's claim, he actually sent photos of Beth along with her birth certificate, her address book, and her business cards, which basically proves that whoever was sending these letters was likely the killer. But despite some fingerprints being pulled from the package, they didn't match anyone in their systems. Now, since the time of this murder, there have been hundreds and hundreds of suspects. Like, there are more suspects in this case than any other that I've ever seen, like by a mile. After just 1 year of investigation, police had already considered 192 people as suspects. And shockingly, to this day, there have been over 500 confessions from people saying that they committed this murder. And yet none of them were arrested. Which, that's crazy, because essentially what that means is at least 499 people lied about committing this horrible murder, which is about the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life. But it just goes to show you how difficult of a case that the police were dealing with here. And what made it even more difficult was the amount of BS that was being reported on by the national media. I mean, papers and tabloids would just make stuff up at the time, and people would take it as fact. And that information has been passed on all throughout time, and to this day it has muddled the truth of this case. Like, for example, there were reports that Beth would sleep with any man who would feed her, and that she was a call girl or a prostitute. But to this day, there's been no evidence of that. It was just something that tabloids reported on at the time, and everybody just kind of believed it. So basically what I'm saying is that there was so much information out there that wasn't truthful that it made the case 10 times harder to solve. But to this day, there are still a few suspects that, in my opinion, really stand out. And one of them, I am all but convinced, committed this crime. Now, the first suspect we're going to be talking about is a man named Mark Hansen. And the case against him is interesting to say the least. On the day before Beth's disappearance, he actually spoke to her on the phone, meaning that he was one of the last people to talk to her while she was alive. And when police had questioned him about what he had talked to Beth about, apparently he gave conflicting statements. Also, Beth was living with Hansen's girlfriend at the time, but despite this, he actually still tried to seduce Beth, and she actually had to turn him down. So could Hansen have killed her in a rage because she wasn't attracted to him? I mean, unfortunately, that motive has caused more than a few murders in the past. But one of the most interesting clues that points to Hansen being the killer was actually in the belongings that were sent into the police. Beth's address book was found in there, and on the cover of the address book was the name Mark Hansen, which that alone isn't incriminating, but it definitely is sketchy. And it's also been rumored that Hansen spent some time in Sweden's medical surgical school, which is significant because, like I said, there were exact cuts and procedures done to this body, and whoever killed her would have had to have had medical experience. But in terms of evidence, the case against Hansen kind of stops here. Yes, there have been some reports that link him with the mob, but those have not been confirmed, and I'm starting to believe that that was another one of these tabloid lies that has just been passed on through time. So with no proof of that, I can't count that in the evidence. But could it have been a murder out of jealousy and rage? Sure. And I think that Beth turning him down is one of the most significant pieces of evidence in this particular case. But again, it's not really incriminating. And as for the address book, Hansen actually said that he had never personally used it, and he had just given it to Beth as a gift to kind of help her out. So it's weird because I feel like there's enough information here to make me suspicious of Hansen, and to this day I'm not surprised that he's still considered a suspect, but there just isn't enough to fully convince me. And for that reason, I have to look at some other possibilities. So when looking for a suspect in a murder case, I think you always have to start with whoever saw that person last. And in this case, that was Robert Manley. As mentioned before, Manley had stayed with Beth at a hotel the night of the 8th. And he had actually seen her the day that she had disappeared. Now, we all know that Manley was married and he had a kid, and yet he was spending so much time with Beth, who was an attractive, vulnerable 22-year-old girl. And they had even been sleeping in the same hotel room. Now, I'm not going to say that there's anything inherently wrong with that, but I'm just saying that kind of raises a few eyebrows. And the night before Beth's disappearance, the two had been out drinking and partying. So perhaps they got back to the hotel room in a drunken state, and maybe Manley decided to sleep with Beth because he wouldn't have been thinking straight. Now, realizing afterwards that he had essentially just ruined his marriage, maybe he killed Beth to keep that secret from getting out. I mean, in theory, this kind of sounds like a realistic and possible story. But the truth is, we can't say for sure whether any of it's really true. And Manley maintained that he had never actually slept with her, and because Beth's no longer with us, there's no one who could really tell us otherwise. But to me, what makes the case against Manley so interesting is Manley's mental state. Manley was actually discharged from the military due to the fact that he had some form of mental disability. He was said to have frequent nervous breakdowns, and he even claimed that he was hearing voices in his head. And after Beth's death, things had gotten so bad that Manley was actually put into a psychiatric center by his own wife. This was a man that by all accounts wasn't mentally well. But again, we have a suspect who raises some serious questions, but ultimately has no real evidence against him. I mean, all the evidence that we have is based off of speculation, and we all know that that's not going to win any court cases.
And Manley was actually able to pass 2 polygraph tests at the time, which, let's be real, they aren't always the most accurate, but passing 2 tests certainly helps his case.
Plus, there's also no evidence that Manley had any experience with the human body, making it unclear how he would have been able to perform such elaborate operations. So again, I think we have to look elsewhere. Now, to me, our third and final suspect is definitely the most intriguing. And that suspect is a man named Doctor George Hodel. And there is so much to unpack here. So in 1999, George Hodel passed away, and he left behind a son named Stephen and a daughter named Tamar, along with a ton of other kids that don't really matter. Wait, okay, that kind of sounds harsh. Let me backtrack on that one. They don't really matter in terms of this case right now. Is that better? Not really. Now, both Tamar and Stephen had not met up until their father had died. And when they finally met for the first time, Tamar actually admitted that she was suspicious of her own father being the Black Dahlia killer. And this was a claim that seemingly came out of nowhere for Stephen because his father really wasn't considered a serious suspect. So in an effort to clear his father's name once and for all, Stephen decided to devote his life into solving this crime. And he was more than qualified to do so, considering that he was actually a retired homicide detective, and he had solved over 200 murders in his life. But instead of clearing his father's name, he actually became convinced that his father was the killer. So for starters, he discovered that his father had issues with sex. By all accounts, it can be assumed that he was a sex addict, and he had multiple lovers in his house, even despite having a wife and kids. And one of these lovers was apparently Beth. But the sexual obsession took a dark turn in 1949, when his own daughter Tamar accused him of having sex with her when she was just 11 to 14 years old. And apparently there were also witnesses who claimed that they had seen this illegal relationship, but despite this and the allegations, he was never charged. But this is so significant because during this investigation, police had actually bugged Dr. George Hodel's house, and what they caught was just disturbing. In one of the tapes, a woman could be heard screaming multiple times from somewhere in the house. And later that day, Hodel was caught talking to someone, saying, "Realized there was nothing I could do. Put a pillow over her head and cover her with a blanket. Get a taxi. Expired 12:59. They thought there was something fishy. Anyway, now they may have figured it out. Killed her." Okay, wait. Who talks like that? But their surveillance continued, and eventually they caught Hodel saying something even crazier. "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now. They couldn't talk to my secretary anymore. Because she dead." I don't think he's actually Southern. But in my mind, he's like a cowboy. Yeehaw. What the fuck can I say? I think I need a break. Now, this statement is especially shocking considering that Hodel's secretary had just died from a drug overdose. A death where many believe Hodel had actually murdered her. And this was believed because Hodel was the only one with her at the time that she died. And before he even reported her death, he had burned most of her belongings, maybe in an attempt to cover up some form of evidence. I don't know. Whatever it is, it was sketchy as hell. I mean, holy shit, this guy kind of sounds terrible and terrifying. But just because he was accused of these horrible crimes, and maybe if he even did do them, it doesn't make him guilty in the Black Dahlia case, but it paints the picture of the type of man Hodel was. Not a very good one. So let's look at some of the evidence against him in the Black Dahlia case. To start, he was a doctor with surgical training. Also, by many accounts, he had had a romantic relationship with Beth before her death, something that was confirmed by his wife at the time. A picture was also found in Hodel's belongings that many people believe is of Beth, and his son Steve is convinced that this is indeed a picture of the Black Dahlia. But to this day, it still hasn't been confirmed or denied whether this is even her. Also, Hodel hadn't become an official suspect in the crime until 1949, after his daughter had came forward with her allegations. And interestingly enough, just 1 year later, he left California and moved to Hawaii, or maybe the Philippines. I don't know. I see a lot of conflicting reports on where he moved, but he left California. So one could maybe believe that he was fleeing.
It's also noted that there are similarities between Hodel's handwriting and the letters sent in to the LAPD.
Plus, there was a car spotted at the scene of the crime on the morning of the murder that supposedly matched Hodel's car. Now I look at some of this evidence, plus the history of Hodel, and I feel like it's a pretty strong case against him. But I'm left wondering why he was never charged of this crime or really viewed as a serious suspect back in the day. Like, he was viewed as a suspect, but he wasn't at the top of the list. And I mean, based off of the tapes and the fact that he had burned his secretary's belongings, I mean, it seems pretty clear that he maybe should have been charged with her murder. So why was he never charged? Well, there's a theory out there that might explain this. So at this time, the LAPD was notoriously corrupt. I mean, in terms of regulations, things are nothing like they were now than they were back then. And it's believed that the LAPD actually had reason to protect Hodel. Now, allegedly, Hodel was using his office to perform illegal abortions in the Los Angeles area. So if members of the LAPD or big businessmen or Hollywood actors came into his office for either them or their wives or girlfriends or baby mamas, and that information had gotten out to the public, then that would be a huge deal. Like, that could ruin somebody's career, and that could really get you in a lot of trouble because abortions were illegal. So assuming this is true, Hodel could have easily blackmailed the Hollywood elite or even the LAPD and threatened to release all the incriminating evidence against all of them if he were to be arrested. And this really makes sense to me. Like, I can imagine some big businessman or some big politician telling the LAPD to back off this guy or else they were about to get exposed. And the LAPD was so corrupt at the time, you guys already know. And adding some validity to this theory, the LAPD has now admitted that most of the physical evidence in the Black Dahlia case is missing, meaning that it was potentially disposed of in order to protect Hodel. So I really don't think that this theory is that much of a reach. So I think going off all of the evidence that we have today, Dr. George Hodel is definitely my main suspect. And his son Stephen Hodel actually went on to publish a series of books that kind of includes all of the evidence against his father. And his first book was actually read by the head deputy DA, Stephen Kay. And Kay was so swayed by the book that he actually went on record saying that he would have no problem charging Dr. Hodel with 2 counts of murder. One for Beth and one for his secretary. Too bad Dr. Hodel is dead now. Not F in the chat. So what do you guys think? Was Dr. George Hodel actually the killer, or do you believe that it was someone else? Make sure to let me know in the comments. Also, I'm doing a Q&A for my 1,000 subscriber special, which I will address in the next video. So if you guys have any questions that you want me to answer on camera, also let me know down in the comments. Well, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you soon with another video.